Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, a webinar entitled Standardizing Carbon Neutrality, a milestone on the way to net zero. My name is Els, and I will be moderating the webinar in the background, as usual. All the attendees are muted for the moment, and they will be muted during the whole presentation. We invite you to use the Q&A panel for entering your questions, should you have questions. The chat is by default also disabled for all the attendees, so please use that Q&A for all your questions. The speakers will be having a look at the questions raised during the presentations, and if some questions are still unreplied, we'll have a moment at the end of the presentation for looking at them. Should your question remain unreplied today, please don't worry, because we intend to make a Q&A report available on our website. You will also be notified when that is available. Can we please have the next slide, Andrea?
Please start recording, Els.
Yes, it is recording already. So as I said, my name is Els, and I'm the webinar moderator as usual for the webinars that CEN-CENELEC are organizing. On the next slide, we can see the little Q&A panel that you are supposed to use when entering your questions. Should you be on Twitter, feel free to tag us and to talk about this subject. Of course, we have a dedicated hashtag trainings for standards for that. So without further ado, I suggest that we continue with the actual presentation. We have invited today 3 speakers. I will be presenting them on each of them on a separate slide. So I can have the next slide, please, Andrea, because I think you are opening this presentation with an introduction to standardization and climate change. So please, Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Els. So my name is Andrea, and I am managing programs and projects at CEN-CENELEC, all what is related to environment, climate, and energy management. So today we are going to speak about climate neutrality, and I'm very pleased that so many of you are interested in this topic. But before starting to speak straight away about climate neutrality, allow me to say a few words about who we are and what we do. So the European standard organizations are CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI. CEN is the European Committee for Standardization, CENELEC, European Committee for Electrotechnical Standardization, and there's also a third European Standard Organization for Telecommunication. These 3 standard organizations are recognized by EU regulation. Today, we are representing only the first 2. We are basically from the CEN-CENELEC Management Center and the invited colleagues. Standardization happens at different levels. There's the national level, the European level, and international level. So the aim is always to have identical standards in Europe and worldwide. What is a standard document? Maybe those who are connected may not know what it is. So this is why I would like to explain. This is a technical document designed to be used as a rule, as a method, as a guideline, a definition, which is produced by all interested parties in a transparent, open, and consensus-based process. We have transparent rules for that, which are available on our website. It is intended for common and repeated use in Europe and beyond, and is voluntary in use. And it's approved by recognized bodies, CEN and CENELEC, which are recognized by European law. And it's a tool which can underpin legislation. Many standards are supporting European legislation, and they are referenced in the official journal. And obviously, they are recognized for this reason by the businesses and regulators. You can see the front page of a standard on the right side of my slide. Of course, not all of them look like that, but this is a CENELEC standard. We have CEN standards and CEN-CENELEC standards as well. We connect many experts, over 200,000. We have 33 national members. We have European organizations who are members, associations and federations of businesses, consumers, environmental and societal organizations, institutions and governmental bodies, including the European Commission and the European Free Trade Association, EFTA. And we have affiliates. These are standard bodies in countries that are cooperating with the European Union but are not members, or not members yet. And also we have a strong international cooperation in place with ISO, IEC, International Standard Organization, International Electrotechnical Commission, and regions and countries outside European Union and EFTA. Now let's talk about the climate. You all know what climate change is, but just allow me to reiterate why it's important to tackle climate change. As it was published in the special report in 2018 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, its report, IPCC report is called and quoted often, human activities have caused temperature increase 1.5 centigrades above the pre-industrial times, which is quite high. And this is leading to global warming. And it caused changes in climate and impacts on natural and human systems, not only across the continents, but also in the oceans. And what we experienced over the past years is this is becoming worse. Temperatures are still increasing, and we experience more and more extreme events as well. So climate change is an existential threat. Therefore, increased climate action is very important, and the enhanced ambition is definitely required. I would like to say a few words about the view of the EU regarding the climate action. So the EU considers that emissions must be reduced in all sectors, from industry to transport and farming. And climate action should be regarded as an opportunity for all sectors of the economy in the Union to innovate and to decouple economic growth from greenhouse gas emissions. The EU is currently a leader in the transition towards climate neutrality and would like to remain a leader and would like to help to raise global ambition and to strengthen the global response to climate change. And the standardization committees community is committed to contribute to the transition. For instance, CEN-CENELEC issued a policy paper earlier in November during the time of the COP26 conference. In this paper, it is explained how CEN-CENELEC and the European Standardization Community is committed to support this transition by European standards. And ISO also issued declarations called London Declaration regarding to climate change. And CEN-CENELEC is very much supporting this declaration, which is about combating climate change through standards. So a few words about the policy background which exists currently. The European climate policy framework basically has two major elements. First one is the European Green Deal, which was issued in December 2019. And its aim was to make Europe the first climate neutral continent by 2050. To be able to properly support this objective, this year, Europe adopted a so-called climate law, which is in force already since summer. And it brought binding greenhouse gas emission reduction targets of at least 55% by 2030. And it envisages a new target for 2040 to make sure that the objective of the climate neutrality is achieved by 2050. Yes, the EU is fighting climate change, but climate change cannot be tackled within the European Union and in isolation only. This is a global threat and can only be addressed by a global response. Therefore, the EU is actively engaging in climate action and supports its international partners in it. As regards international framework on climate action, the major elements are the United Nations 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development, which has 13 SDGs, 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And one of these goals is goal number 13, is dedicated to climate action. And the other one is the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change and its Paris Agreement. Standards support these policies, both European and international policies. They contribute to this transition by providing reliable solutions to industry and support to policy implementation. And they provide also methods and approaches that ensure comparability, transparency, and they are also certifiable both at European and global level. In Europe, to improve the coordination regarding climate action and standards, a new technical committee was established, CEN-TC 467, climate change, and they have the role of better coordinate European action and standardization, to better support European policy initiatives, and to closely follow up international developments and also support that. So this is about the general background, what I wanted to share with you. And now our guest speakers, Marie and Jan, will speak about the carbon neutrality. This will be explained to you in more details, and also about carbon neutrality claims, as well as the standards development regarding carbon neutrality, which started at international level and currently ongoing. So, Marie, you are the first speaker. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrea and Els, and thank you for the opportunity to present here today. So my name is Marie Gustafsson. I'm a principal consultant at South Pole. We are a global climate solutions provider, and we work globally with hundreds of organizations and corporates to establish footprint inventories and how to make claims on carbon and climate neutrality. So I hope to share with you today views on the current situations and challenges, opportunities when making claims about carbon neutrality and climate neutrality. And just linking together with what Andrea just mentioned, this is very much from the corporate perspective, so less from, say, a government or national claim, but this is really what private actors are doing. So to make it tangible of what we're talking about today, I've started with a slide of the typical claims that we are talking about. So you've seen these on home pages, you see them on products and another, maybe on event leaflets and so on. A hotel that is carbon neutral, a climate neutral building, etc. Next slide, please. And those were a couple of examples, and here is also another bunch of examples on now in the setting of labels. So there are many organizations issuing labels, such as NGOs. UN has also a label. South Pole and our branch colleagues do also issue labels that talk about climate neutrality or carbon neutrality. And there are labels that are used globally or even regional and national ones. And what I want to talk about today is really what are behind those labels. So what's happening now and hopefully also in the future, which Ian will come to. But before going into what's happening today, I want to just mention why organizations, corporates are making these types of claims. So just saying that something is carbon neutral or climate neutral is much more a compact message compared to writing a long text about your sustainability and climate efforts. And it's also something that you can put on a package very simply. So therefore, there is a wish and desire to use a statement as climate neutral or carbon neutral. And doing this, you engage both your internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. So your clients, your partners, but also your employees, for instance. We hear a lot that climate neutrality claims is important for staff retention, for instance. When you do these types of claims, you demonstrate that you take ownership of the emissions that you do cause, because we are acting in the economy that we are. Yeah, it's just the case that most organizations do emit greenhouse gases, but to engage and do, for instance, a climate or carbon neutrality claim, you demonstrate that you take ownership on what you can do. And then there, of course, is an advocacy. You push, you show to society and try to push the society to do the same thing. But it's also a way to ensure, push yourself to continue doing efforts, because if you say that you're climate neutral one year, you probably want to continue doing that the following years. And finally, this is then also used in reporting. So even if there's no legal requirements anywhere to be carbon neutral or climate neutral, it is often published in the context of a sustainability report. Next slide, please. So, so now I want to walk through what is typically the background of a carbon neutrality claim or a climate neutrality claim. Like before you make the claim on your homepage or on your product, what is it that you've actually done? But there, first thing, I would like to take a step back, especially as this is a webinar with strong links to standards, to talk about what are the actual definitions that exist on carbon neutrality and climate neutrality. And you will understand soon why I continue to mention these two terms consistently in the same sentence. The IPCC has a definition published in the report that Andrea referred to previously. And it says that carbon neutrality, it's used synonymously as net zero CO2 emissions, and that net zero carbon dioxide emissions are achieved when anthropogenic CO2 emissions are balanced globally by anthropogenic CO2 removals over a specified period. So as you hear, it is quite technical. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. And this is the continuation of how IPCC defines carbon neutrality and also climate neutrality. So IPCC makes a difference between carbon neutrality and climate neutrality, where carbon neutrality only refers to CO2 emissions, so carbon dioxide, the most common greenhouse gas, whereas climate neutrality accounts for all greenhouse gases and also other effects in the climate system, such as albedo effects, for instance. And the thing here is that given that these definitions are quite technical, that leaves room for interpretation. And also these terms have had more attention in the scientific community the last couple of years, whereas claims on the markets of a company saying we are a climate neutral company, for instance, that has been done since over 10 years. So there's actually quite a disrupt between what the definitions of IPCC says and what's done at the market. So for instance, on the markets, what's typically done is that carbon neutrality and climate neutrality is used synonymously. It is more a question on if you're in the US or in Europe or in what country you are, but they basically mean the same. It's the same thing. And also actually on the market, generally carbon neutrality is something different than being net zero. So this is unfortunately how it looks, and Ian will speak a bit more about how we try to tackle this by creating standards. But I will continue my presentation talking about what is typically the background of a climate neutrality or carbon neutrality claim at the market today. So next slide, please. So what's typically done in practice before an organization says that they are climate neutral? Typically, it is that their emission is quantified. So their greenhouse gas footprint is calculated. So calculating the emissions that are caused by the organization. If it can be for say a product or for an event. So similarly there, the emissions caused by the product are calculated. And then in order to claim climate neutrality or carbon neutrality, the same number of corresponding carbon offsets are purchased. So carbon offsets or carbon compensation, that could also be a big topic of several webinars. But for those who are not familiar with the term, a carbon offset or carbon credit is a the result of a project to reduce emissions. So it can be planting forest or replacing fossil electricity by renewable electricity. But this project, it has to be shown to be additional, so that it would not happen unless a carbon crediting program was in place. So you need to show that this project is additional, and therefore you can get you can claim it to be a carbon credit, and there are various mechanisms and standards and verification mechanisms to ensure this. So that is typically what happens. There's a quantification of the footprint of the organization, the product, etc., and the same amount of carbon compensation products is purchased. Next slide, please. And then in certain cases, there is also a reduction strategy set. So a climate target and or a reduction plan in order to reach that target. And then, as you can imagine, making a claim where you actually have a reduction plan is generally seen as much more credible, because it's not just that you are quantifying and purchasing compensation, but you're actually working with your proper emissions and reducing them. So this is typically what happens before, or like in order to make a claim. However, how easy these 4 steps can look on one slide, there can be quite a vast difference in what's actually behind, what's actually done in practice. So as you may know, often the devil is in the detail. So a product that is climate neutral, a product A and a product B, both are labeled as carbon neutral or climate neutral, but the actions to motivate this claim are really different, both in practical and economical terms. So now I will speak a bit about this. Next slide, please. So I've made a list of some of the typical differences behind, or like in the process of making claims. It's not an extensive list, but it's the key ones that I wanted to cover. So the first one is the scope of the calculated and then offset footprint. So here we have the example of someone wanting to make a claim that we have a carbon neutral product, and then how should you calculate the footprint, the GHG emission footprint of that product? Well, you can look at the whole chain life cycle of the product. So from the extraction of the raw materials in order to produce the product, all the way until the product is disposed. So say it goes into landfill, or it's incinerated, or if it's recycled. That is a cradle to grave analysis. But there are also analysis that may be from cradle to gate. So just from the extraction of the raw materials until the gate of the production factory. And for some products, this cradle to gate may cover actually the absolute majority of the emissions. But as you can imagine, for many products, this is actually a smaller part of the what greenhouse gas emissions are caused by product. If you are, say, producing something that consumes electricity, or you have a product with a lot of organic material that goes into landfill disposal, the use phase of your product, say your product uses electricity, the use phase of that product will cause quite significant emissions. And the same with something that goes into landfill, that can be also quite an important part. So depending on how you have done the assessment, thank you, Andrea. Depending on how you have done the assessment, you will have a different footprint and number of, the amount of greenhouse gases that needs to be offset. Now we can go to next slide. Thank you. So if I started to speak about products, if we now speak about organizations, this slide shows a graph based on the greenhouse gas protocol, the GHG protocol. It addresses how you should, guidance on how to do an inventory, a calculated greenhouse gas footprint for an organization. It's the most common used standard to do these kinds of calculations. And it is also aligned with several ISO standards. The greenhouse gas protocol divides emission types in scope 1, 2, and 3, where scope 1 is really the direct emissions happening in your buildings caused by the cars that you are owning or controlling. So emissions very closely tied to your operations. Scope 2 is purchased electricity, steam heating and cooling. And then scope 3 is everything else of types of emissions that you as an organization can generate. It involves commuting, it involves business travel, it's the operational waste that you cause, it's all the transport and distribution. So if you are a manufacturing company, transport and distribution will be very important. Also, in the products that you produce, the materials to produce those, that is included in the category of purchased goods and services. And you have, again, the use phase and also investments, for instance, if you're a financial institution. So scope 3 is really quite wide. And for many organizations, it's the scope 3 that is some 90% of your emissions. Nevertheless, there are organizations that do claim climate neutrality or carbon neutrality, just only including scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that can be really like just a tiny part of your footprint. So you would still make a claim, but without actually considering your full, the full actual emissions that you are generating as an organization. And this has implications in economical terms, in the sense of if you purchase offsets, that is a cost, but also in terms of the resources that you allocate in order to calculate your footprint, because if you're a large organization, that requires or can require quite a bit of resources, or you work with the consultancy. But it also, if you don't have the full view of the emissions that your organizations are actually causing, then it's much you can also not address the emissions and reduce. So these are there are some quite significant and important implications on how ambitious you actually are when you're calculating your footprint, and therefore also what you have as basis for climate neutrality. So next slide, please. So that was quite a lot on the scope of what you calculate, and I try to illustrate it also a little bit on the side with an example of like how much you actually include in as your footprint that you calculate and offset. So that's one thing that can be very different between different organizations making claims. Another difference can be if the calculations are verified by a third party. And it's not that in all cases it's bad with calculations that are not third party verified, but of course it provides less guarantees, especially if the calculation of the emissions have been a lot based on estimations and no one has had a second check on that. There are just less guarantees for a consumer, for instance. Third point, something I touched briefly upon before, certain claims are made without having any reduction plan or any target, climate reduction target set. Some really do, and I may come to that later, what we require at South Pole. Then also the compensation credits, the offsets that are used in order to compensate your emissions can also vary a lot in nature. There are, as I mentioned, various monitoring systems and standards and methodologies in order to ensure that credits are legit. But there are also many types of projects that don't follow these standards, and many of those can for certainly be good. But as again with the verification, there are less guarantees that a project that are not that is not done according to a certified standard, that you can trust that the CO2 reductions actually happen. And finally, certain do climate neutrality or carbon neutrality claims without being very transparent about it. They may just say that they are climate or carbon neutral and maybe make a bit short statement about it. In other cases, there are quite higher require of transparency, that you actually publish what you have done, what you have calculated. Like, for instance, how big of a scope of your footprint have you taken into account, and what type of credits have you used? So those are some of the one, I would say, the 5 top differences between different claims that are made. Next slide, please. However, even if it is at the moment quite dynamic and there is a lack of standards and streamlining of the market, many parts of society, government, civil society, corporate reporting initiatives, and consumers and investors are getting much more aware of these confusions and are raising the requirements. You have all heard how there is a lot of talk about avoiding greenwashing, and that consumers in particular are really requiring that corporates don't make claims that are not true. Next slide, please. And there is certain regulation on the way on the topics. And here, given that we have a European angle here, Europe is one of the, is really the leading region on this. So France has passed some legislations on what claims you can do, and consumer and market authorities in certain countries in Europe are also passing guidance or requirements on what claims you can do. And also, as you can see, Australia and New Zealand also are active in the space. Next slide, please. And this is actually my final slide before I hand over to Ian. So a lot of the points that I want to make is that that there are many claims being made, and it is not always ambitious climate action behind it. South Pole do have labels for climate neutrality for our label, which do cover the themes that which I've discussed, so that a calculated carbon footprint should be comprehensive to include scope 1, 2, and 3. One should use established footprint standards, set reduction targets in line with the science-based target approach, which is basically the Paris Agreement for corporates. Offset should be of high quality with verified projects, and there should be footprints and the efforts that you undertake should be disclosed. And then there should also be an annual assessment that you're actually following your reduction plan and achieve reductions according to your plans. But we are very much looking forward to further standardization on this area, and also, I think Ian will cover the rest. So I will hand over the word to him. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Marie, for this interesting overview. I would like indeed to give the floor now to Ian. Can we have, yes, a slide here. So Ian is convener of the working group Carbon Neutrality of the subcommittee 7 of ISO TC 207, and also principal of his own energy and carbon consultancy services organization. So please, Ian, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Els, and hello everyone. And thank you for coming along this afternoon. As has been said there, I have my own little consultancy, and I have been working quite a lot in practice with people trying to make claims about, first of all, working out what their carbon footprints are, and then whether or not they can offset them, both in the public sector and on the smaller private sector, but not for very large companies. Next slide, please. I think in response to the questions that Mari's raised, we realise that there's a lot of claims out there. People are talking about carbon neutrality, whether or not we like it, and that therefore there's probably a benefit for trying to standardise that, so that at least people can come up with a reasonably high quality definition of what's meant by neutrality. This will also hopefully allow the public to have a greater understanding of what is meant. I mean, there's a lot of, as I said, there's a lot of things out there. In fact, what we see there, as I was writing the slides, I sort of picked up the can of beer next to me and discovered that it had a whole host of information about how they claim to be the world's first carbon negative beer, but there were no numbers. There was no hard saying, what is the footprint before we've done anything? There wasn't really any clue about what they've done to reduce the footprint, other than they might have planted a few trees somewhere, although they didn't quite say where. And I think this underlines that there's a very strong risk of greenwash if we allow things to go on. And as following Paris and following Glasgow, this has gained a greater awareness amongst the general public, that I think we have a responsibility to the public to at least offer a robust and strong response to carbon neutrality that can be followed by those who are prepared to, put their numbers on the line and actually demonstrate publicly that they've done something rather than perhaps gone away and bought a few offsets. So I'll start off by looking first of all about offsets. And the confusion with net zero. Sorry, next slide, please. A lot of what's going on at the moment is couched in terms of net zero, possibly because carbon neutrality has become a little bit, people are a little bit concerned that carbon neutrality isn't worth a great deal or doesn't say a great deal. Mary very helpfully showed us the IPCC definitions. ISO is actually trying to distinguish slightly differently between them because we are conscious of what we think the market out there is really meaning by carbon neutral, which is a little bit different. The one thing we do find, though, is that net zero nearly always comes with a date. So people will talk about being net zero by 2030, by 2040, 2050, whenever. And that's great, that's a target. It would be good if they can achieve it, but we recognize that perhaps there can be things they can be doing on the way to demonstrate that they're achieving it. And indeed, they can be offsetting any unabated emissions along the route. Because we note also that a lot of the time when people are talking about carbon neutral, in contrast to net zero, they're not saying we'll be carbon neutral in 2030, 40 or 50. They're actually saying we're carbon neutral today. We are already now. And that's one reason why we think it's important to actually distinguish between them as it's used in the marketplace. The little chart, though, which actually was very similar to the one that was skipped over right at the end of Mary's presentation. I was expecting she would have done all the hard work explaining it, but I'll try and quickly run through it. The top line of the emissions decline there is, actually it's a little yellow line, but you probably can't see that on the screen. It's what the gross emissions of the organisation or the product system or whatever we're looking at are. And that's being declined. So we are taking real action to reduce emissions. That's very important we do that. And that it's not therefore the business as usual line. The business as usual line would probably be continuing to rise up over the period that we're looking at. And in this hypothetical example shown by the chart, we're probably going to aim to reach net zero after 10 years. And that's when the red line effectively hits the bottom, hits the zero, the axis. But in the meantime, through GHG removals enhancements, or perhaps through the introduction of on-site generation, which is then being exported, we've actually got a degree of real reductions in order to get to that final net zero position by the end of the 10-year period. But whilst we're doing so, we still have unabated emissions. And these unabated emissions are effectively indicated by the brown bars. And they are what, in a carbon neutrality scenario, we think you've got to go away and find an offset or a carbon credit to get rid of. Next slide, please. So at the moment, we see that there's a lot of claims around, but they're typically from organizations that are actually focusing on the offset side. They're from those who are selling offsets. They're not really looking too much at what you're doing beforehand. And they are very much perhaps allowing business as usual before you buy your credits or before you buy your offsets and go, and then you can claim neutrality. We don't think that's good enough. Next click, please. And the next, I think. Yeah, thank you. We don't think that people should be allowed to do that, at least not to be able to claim compliance with an international standard. Because at the moment we see a number of problems. There's no certainty around the calculation of emissions. If we go back to my can of beer, it didn't actually tell me what they had calculated. It didn't tell me what it ran to. Was it just the contents of the can? Was it the can and the contents? Was it all the travel to deliver it to me? Was it how I disposed of the can afterwards? We don't know. There's no clarity on the scope of boundaries. Very similar. There wasn't actually an indication as to whether it was just looking at CO2 emissions, or carbon dioxide, or whether it was looking at the full basket of greenhouse gas emissions. It certainly didn't tell me anything about the life cycle. It just told me, here is a can, we've got no emissions. And there was no apparent incentive to lower the emissions, other than the fact it was probably costing them money to plant trees to offset those emissions. There was nothing to stop them continuing with business as usual and to continue to churn out cans and cans of beer, but without necessarily doing anything to reduce emissions along that, as part of that manufacturing process. And finally, as a result, we're not really sure how that could contribute to a low carbon transition, to the path to a global carbon neutrality or a global net zero. Next slide, please. So I suppose you could ask, well, why do we need to do this? Why do we need to bring rigor back? I think I probably sort of half answered the question because the claims are already out there. And by the way, I'm not getting at the brewers. What they were doing there was actually probably rather better and told me rather more than most claims for carbon neutrality do at the moment. But we need a much more robust framework. And I think within the sort of standards community of CEN, ISO, we feel that we can build upon existing standards for quantification and for management in order to be able to produce a much stronger and more robust answer towards carbon neutrality. And within that, I think there are three key elements, which is that we must calculate the full carbon footprint on a life cycle basis and with all the GHG emissions associated, not just CO2. Secondly, we have to have a plan to show how we're reducing emissions and can show real savings. So it's not just business as usual with a few offsets. And finally, when we do have unabated emissions that are offset, we need to have a rules that say they've got to be done with good quality carbon credits. So let's look at these in a bit more in turn and see how they affect the draft ISO standard. Next slide, please. I'll start with a full carbon footprint. As I suggested before, it must cover all emissions, and that's all types of greenhouse gas, not just CO2, but also it must cover direct and significant indirect emissions in accordance with ISO 14064 Part 1 and 14067 for products. It can apply to organizations, products, services. It can apply, in fact, to almost anything. And the principles are just the same. We could actually use it also for public bodies or for local authorities. We probably wouldn't expect it to be applied at a national level because the situation there is somewhat different. And although in the table there we have slight differences for organizations and products and services, fundamentally they are identical. Effectively, they're just saying the 3 points that we had before in terms of the points before we had in terms of carbon footprint. You've got to include everything, and you mustn't try and ring fence the good bits and leave out the bad bits. So if you're doing an organization, it has to have a very clear boundary and scope. It could be all the operations in Belgium, for example, but it can't just be, say, the head office that we've got in Brussels, and we're going to ignore all the polluting plants that are busy manufacturing somewhere else in the country. Next slide, please. As far as calculation methods go, we would like, but we're not going to insist on people using the existing ISO standards. They're out there. They provide good guidance on process and how to calculate standards, but we're aware there are other methodologies out there as well. There's sometimes national rules that people say you will do your calculation this way, or you will include certain things or use certain conversion factors to get from energy to GHG emission equivalents, for example. And we also recognize that the GHG protocol has a very strong market position, but doesn't have anything specifically around carbon neutrality. And we'd very much like to work with them rather than, in a sense, to try and set up in competition to them. And in fact, in the draft standard, there's an annex which is comparing differences between 14064 and the GHG protocol for organizations. But above all, we see that transparency is very important. And internally, this can be done through something which we're calling a carbon neutrality management plan. Next slide, please. The carbon neutrality management plan is actually quite straightforward. It just sets out for management, for people to understand what the intentions are, what's the period that we're trying to reduce our emissions over to get down towards a net zero. Again, so we can't just do business as usual. And it must be tied in with good scientific principles. But again, we accept that a lot of organizations using international standards are SMEs. They don't have the resources to go away and rediscover or reinvent the science. They need to effectively rely on sometimes quite simple rules thumb, or looking at what perhaps governments are suggesting they should be doing. A couple of things we've been looking at as well, also the situations around growing businesses, and we're not quite sure yet how we're going to cope with that, because we're trying to get people to reduce emissions in absolute terms so that the total emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are falling. But we also recognise that some growing companies, particularly perhaps companies that might be in a sector that's helping reduce emissions in other organisations, may have absolute emissions rising, and therefore we may need to have a look at some form of carbon intensity metric. Next slide, please. And of course, a plan is just a piece of paper. There's a wonderful English phrase that fine words butter no parsnips. You know, you can write down the best thing on a piece of paper, but if you don't do it, it's pointless or worthless. So we need to make sure that the plans are supported by action and that there are real, measurable and measured emission reductions as a result. This applies whether we're looking at an organisation across the entire organisation or at a particular product that might be claiming carbon neutrality. Although again, we accept that perhaps that with products, there may well be sort of step changes, that the process doesn't change from one year to the next, but then the following year changes significantly. And in order to sort of support this, everything needs to have a very carefully worked through baseline so that we know what we're measuring against as the starting point. Next slide, please. And then finally, that brings us to the third pillar, which is about offsetting and about making sure we use good quality offsets. And I think there's two rules here that we wanted to say. And the first one is that we can only do it after we've done the reductions and the removal enhancements. So for example, year one claims aren't going to be allowed in 14068 because people haven't started on the process of reduction. And when we're talking about unabated emissions, we mean ones that haven't yet reduced. We don't mean ones that aren't realistic to eliminate, which are sometimes referred to as residual. And I think there was a question in the chat earlier on about that, as to who determines what's capable of being avoided or eliminated at the end of the process. With carbon neutrality, we're not really going there. We're actually saying that we recognise that you're on a pathway to net zero. And whilst you're on that pathway, you will have unabated emissions that you've not yet got round to reducing. And they are the ones that have to be offset. And then finally, we have some quality criteria for credits that are used. I won't read through those. I don't think there's anything particularly unusual or surprising about that. But again, transparency is an important part of it so that people know what they're getting. Next slide, please. Finally, a few words about ISO and about the process so far. There was a question raised as to why this is being done at ISO level rather than CEN. I think quite simply it's because the 14064, 14067, there's a series of standards out there that are already within ISO. It makes sense to fit in with those. CEN doesn't have its own standards. There was an existing British stand, or British BSI, British Standards Institution, public accessible specification, PAS 2060. We've drawn on some of the concepts and some of the points in our work in writing an ISO, but the final standard will be quite different. That's inevitable. It's partly a matter of style, but it's also to some extent that things have moved on since the PAS was first written over 10 years ago. And we also recognise that carbon dioxide doesn't follow national borders. And so we feel that it's important that, particularly a lot of products are manufactured and sold internationally, that we have an international standard that can be used widely anywhere. Next slide, please. And as I said, we are on a working group of this. Mary is a very helpful and valuable member of the working group as well. There's actually around 130 people registered to it. And in meetings, we've had up to sort of 50 or 60 experts attending, which is a great process from very many countries around the world. It's been, as a result, quite a slow process. We've also received an awful lot of comments. There were 1,818 on our first working draft, and that's taken us a long time to work through them. But it's very important because a lot of them are bringing up very interesting and very important points that need to be factored in if we're to get to a great consensual standard on this. And we hope to get a standard out somewhere probably at the back end of 2023. Thank you. Next slide. I think that's the one. Andrea, are you going to read these or point these out? Or?
I do that.
Sorry?
Yes, I do that.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for Mary and Jan for their presentation. It was a lot of information, a lot of interesting information, a lot of practical information. And to conclude this webinar, we formulated a few key messages to you, which is summarizing basically what you heard today. So the carbon neutrality, as you heard, can have a very useful role to play in the transition to net zero. But the problem is that currently there's a great variation what is behind carbon and climate neutrality claims. You heard a lot of examples in the previous presentation. So it's very important to have a good quality carbon neutrality, which is not just about offsetting, but it requires action to manage and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's also a problem if there's no standardization, because this can cause confusion, disincentivizes climate action, and facilitates, obviously, greenwashing. So it's very important to have standards in place as soon as possible, both international and European standards, which can help organizations achieve and demonstrate that carbon neutrality in a reliable way. So I think this is the end of the message. So I pass back the floor to Els.